Hey everyone, this is Jordan. Jake can't make this episode, but we wanted to record this as soon as we could, as the 1-year anniversary of the Pulse nightclub shooting is tomorrow, Monday, June 12th. Today, I'll be speaking with Khary Penebaker, a DNC representative, newly elected, former congressional candidate, and stopping gun violence advocate who works with Moms Demand Action and Everytown USA. Khary is a good friend and a sensible voice in the gun control debate. So please welcome Khary Penebaker. So Khary, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So you are a politician in Wisconsin. You're a newly elected DNC member.
Yeah,
is that the title? And you are a gun control and gun reform advocate. Could you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I just recently, a week ago, won my election for the open DNC member position to represent Wisconsin. And I am a gun violence prevention advocate. We never use the word or phrase gun control. It's just not in our lexicon. But my mother completed suicide with a gun when I was very young, and this is a movement that I am passionate about, that I want to help make a difference and save as many lives as possible.
I was reading something you wrote recently,
Mm-hmm.
and you talked about how that incident with your mother,
Mm-hmm.
you don't blame the gun.
No.
And in many instances, people on the gun advocates think that anyone who wants any type of restrictions or sensible measures is anti-gun. Could you explain your stance?
Sure. So I'm not anti-gun at all. I'm anti-gun violence. And I'd never have blamed the gun for my mother's suicide. I blame her access to it. She had easier access to that gun than she did to have adequate access to mental health care, and that is something that is far too common in our society today. I mean, you can here in Wisconsin, you can get a gun today. You can go to a store, pass a background check, and you'll have that gun in your hand today. But it might
Same day,
and it might take you a month to get your first appointment with your therapist, to get the kind of medical or mental health care treatment that you need, and that's just your first appointment. And so when you think about how frequent and impulsive suicide can be, I mean, the majority of suicides occur without a whole lot of planning. And it's when you find yourselves in the throes of severe depression, and you have something that is lethal as a gun that's got a 90% lethality rate to it. There really is no second chance to that. But you look at other means of suicide attempts with pills, for example. That accounts for about 75% of all suicide attempts, but yet it only has less than 5% lethality rate. So people don't immediately die. You have time. You can get to a hospital. You can get your stomach pumped. But one thing my father told me about my mom is you can pump a pill, but you can't pump a bullet.
There's so many different ways. You talk about the ease of access in Wisconsin, and this seems to be an issue nationally. There are ways people can get guns, get around background checks in some instances, like through the gun shows. And there's so many different ways that guns are accessible and available to people with violent pasts, known abusers, and people with other issues that we should be worried about. What are some of the other things and the other ways that we could address this issue by enacting more sensible measures?
Sure. So the most comprehensive way of reducing gun violence is through a universal background check system. So in the states that have universal background checks, you have 48% fewer gun suicides like my mom. You have 47% fewer women that are shot and killed by an intimate partner. And you have 48% fewer police officers that are shot and killed. You also have about 48 or 49% fewer guns that are trafficked. So this is a real policy that can save lives. And if we had a body of elected officials who were interested in making a difference and reducing gun violence, then that would be the first thing they would want to look at. But it's unfortunate that that's not the case right now. You have people who are more interested in being more friendly with the NRA and speaking in gun right talking points as compared to actually saving lives. In fact, I was in a state senate hearing about a week and a half ago where they are trying to get rid of the concealed carry training program. They actually want to. It's called permitless carry, so you don't need a concealed carry permit to conceal carry in Wisconsin, which means you don't have to go through training and all kind of a whole host of things. And so when I testified, I mean, it's like we have a real issue here in Wisconsin where we have about 613 gun deaths per year. And this new bill that they're trying to put forward won't save a single one of them. Like they are only talking in theory as compared to dealing with the actual gun deaths we're having in Wisconsin. And 70% of all the gun deaths in Wisconsin are gun suicides, just like my mom.
And these NRA platform proposals, talking points, they always claim this will make everyone safer. More guns, more good guys with guns is the solution. But ultimately, if you look at their platform and how they've shifted, they just take a new approach. Seemingly every administration to force new things upon the consumer base, and I think now silencers? Yeah. Now everyone should have a silencer. Yeah. So it's all about sales.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about it, they no longer have that black boogeyman and Barack Obama anymore to scare folks into buying more guns because they think he's going to come steal them all from you. Or there's this great gun confiscation operation going on that Obama had planned that he never seemed to be able to get off the ground, apparently. So since they don't have that anymore, they need to find new ways to create new niche markets to get sales up. I mean, at the end of the day, the NRA itself does not represent its membership. What they represent are gun manufacturers and the gun lobby itself. So that's who is putting the overwhelming majority of money into the coffers of the NRA. It's not from the membership of the everyday person who's buying a subscription to the NRA magazine or who's buying NRA T-shirts or a lifetime membership to the NRA. That's not where their money comes from. It's from the manufacturers themselves. And so when you think about their undying need to want to create sales, it's not for the NRA itself. It's so that the gun manufacturers can jack their sales rates up and then in turn give more money to the NRA when they donate. And people make the assumption that the NRA speaks for them, and they don't. When the majority of NRA members support universal background checks, but yet their organization does not, that tells you everything you need to know. And then in terms, again, about that policy in Wisconsin, one of the components of that law would allow a concealed carry holder to bring a gun on school grounds and property. While in 1999, Wayne LaPierre said that we should not have guns on schools, period. This is right after the Columbine shooting. So at one point they were mildly reasonable, but now they've gone so far to the extreme that they can't find their way back home. They can't find a reasonable way to address the problems that our society is facing, because at the end of the day, for them, they just want to get more guns to be sold. That's it.
So you're talking about universal background checks as one of the best steps.
Yep.
So that's just anywhere you get one, no matter what,
Correct.
You have to have a background check. And now what does that background check entail?
So a universal background check system would mean that every gun that is sold, no matter where that engagement occurs, so whether you go to a gun store where you are going to have an interaction with a licensed dealer, which are currently required to initiate background checks, but about 20% of all the guns sold in America are done without a background check, and that is through an in-person sale. So, I mean, some might want to call it a gun show loophole or whatever, but what it really is it's an in-person sale. So here in Wisconsin, you are not required to have a background check if you have an in-person sale that occurs outside of the purview of a licensed dealer. So universal background checks would eliminate that. Everybody who bought a gun has to go through a background check. And what that will do is find out, for one, are you a prohibited purchaser? Are you a felon? Are you a domestic abuser? Have you been mentally adjudicated as being mentally deficient in one way, mentally ill somehow? So if you go to court and you say I'm not guilty by reason of insanity, or that you've been ordered by the court to be committed, you wouldn't be able to buy a gun, and a background check would be able to flesh that out. And without that, you have no idea if you're selling a gun to someone who is a prohibited purchaser. I mean, because all the law is going to require is that you have reasonable suspicion to believe that that person is a prohibited purchaser. And if you can simply say, "Well, I didn't know," well, that's actually a good case for having background checks.
There's also there's other ways people can access guns, and I was talking to someone recently about this boyfriend loophole,
Yeah.
where women are used by their boyfriends who can't buy a gun to buy one for them, and they're not subject to the same marital restrictions. Could you explain that?
Well, so I mean, essentially, what that is a straw purchase, where a person who is not the intended owner of the gun is using money, typically from someone else, to go buy a gun. So that, yeah, that's a crime. I mean, and really, what the boyfriend loophole is where in many states, if you are not a spouse and your partner, your boyfriend, um, commits essentially domestic violence against you, that person isn't going to have their guns taken away from them. I mean, that's really what the boyfriend loophole is, because you're not married. So they don't count that. To me, I mean, if you're a domestic abuser, if you abuse someone physically, that means to me you shouldn't be allowed to have a gun, because the best predicator or the best predictor of future violence is prior violence, and that prior violence can be inflicted upon anyone. So if you have a propensity of beating up your girlfriend, I mean, you're gonna have a higher propensity of increased violence if you have access to a gun. And it should not be a requirement to be married for someone to be a prohibited purchaser if they engage in domestic violence.
Another policy initiative the NRA is proposing is this universal, like nationwide, concealed carry reciprocity.
Yeah.
And that to me just is so frightening. It seems like we'd be entering like the Wild West again, and living in DC, where there's no reciprocity here. I mean, it seems like the exact opposite of a good solution.
Yeah, and what that means is that you are appealing to the lowest common denominator based on the training mechanisms that a given state might have. So if you have a national concealed carry reciprocity, that means the state that has the lowest requirement for concealed carry would apply. So in Wisconsin, let's say, if we require training and additional procedures to get a concealed carry permit, but yet, let's say Alabama does not, and Alabama might say you only have to be 5 years old, and you only have to see out of one eye, and you have to only be you have to be 9 feet tall. I mean, they could have the dumbest thing on the books to get a concealed carry license or whatever their concealed carry permit, and that would apply in Wisconsin. So whatever good policy we have here will be thwarted by the terrible policy that another state might have. And you hear, especially Republicans, talking about states' rights, which is, we don't even need to go down that road right now. But
Yeah.
but they always want to talk about how states should have the right to decide what's best for themselves. And a national concealed carry reciprocity would eliminate that. That means that the great state of Wisconsin could no longer initiate its own concealed carry policy, that it has to abide by the state that has the weakest amount, and that's would be the law of the land. And I don't think that's right. It's not. You can't have any situation where a person can have access to a gun without an adequate amount of training. And here in Wisconsin, there is no time requirement for training. I have a concealed carry permit. and I took a 4-hour class. Thankfully, I had a very very good instructor, who was a personal friend of mine, who agrees with me on gun policy, and he's a Republican. Um, but in Wisconsin, you're not required to go through a 4-hour training class. You could actually get on the phone with someone for 30 seconds and talk just briefly about the issue, and then qualify for a concealed carry permit. I don't think that's right. I mean, in order to be a responsible gun owner, you have to be able to know how to use your gun and how to handle it. And it's not just that you were able to purchase it, but if you can't use and operate that firearm, then you are probably more of a danger to yourself and others than you would be a savior for that day if something bad were to happen.
There's a constitutional law consideration here.
Mm-hmm.
You have the Second Amendment, which guarantees a right
Mm-hmm.
to own firearms. But if you look at the way this issue is analyzed compared with, say, free speech and right to assemble,
Mm-hmm.
you see more restriction. You see people's willingness to impose restrictions on the First Amendment, whereas any attempt to even touch the Second Amendment is met with vehement opposition.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And I just wonder. I wonder what your perspective is on people being so resistant to any type of reform or background check or anything on this issue.
Well, I mean, the Heller decision, which affected, it started from D.C., but it affected the rest of the country, said that, and this is from the conservative darling in Justice Scalia, where he said that no right is without restriction. And that applies to the Second Amendment and the right to own guns. That it can be restricted. I mean, and you even a second ago alluded to the Wild West. Well, what most people don't realize, in the Wild West, you had to check your guns in with the sheriff before you actually went into town. So,
So it'll be
yeah,
worse than that.
yeah. I mean, they had far more restrictive gun policy back then than we do right now. But I think the overwhelming majority of Americans support the reasonable and common sense approach that we have, that we're pushing for in terms of gun policy, where again, universal background checks, keeping guns out of the hands who shouldn't have them, especially when you're looking at those who are violent, whether you are a prior felon or a domestic abuser, someone like that who simply should not have access to guns. And it's a reasonable approach to doing this, and I think ultimately you'll see our country go in the right direction. It just might take a little bit extra work to get there.
So we're approaching the anniversary of the Pulse nightclub shooting. 49 killed, 58 injured. The guy had a Sig Sauer and a Glock, and just ruined hundreds of people's lives. Could anything have been done to stop that? Would a background check have stopped that? Would anything have impeded that?
Yeah, and I believe, if I remember correctly, that he. I thought he passed a background check. I can't remember, but what I do know is that he was on a watch list at some point, and for whatever reason was taken off. Dianne Feinstein, the senator from California, had a bill that would make, if you were on a watch list within the last 5 years, that's something that they could check. So in that case, the shooter would have been flagged as a suspect of some sort, in which case he would not have been able to buy a gun. So that's one thing, but that's a policy that was not in place at that time. I mean, and even with watch lists by themselves aren't the most clear-cut policy, because there are civil liberties to consider. If you're on a list, you may not know it. How do you get off of one? Currently, there's not a solid way or an easy mechanism for doing that. When I ran for Congress last year, that's one of the things that I talked about. Because I think, if you are on a no-fly list, that you shouldn't be able to buy a gun. And right now you can. So I said, well, let's have the policy, but then let's have the other side of that equation, so that if a Steve Smith, who is a friend of mine, his son's name is Scott Smith, the brother's name is Sean Smith, the sister is Shannon, then there's Sarah. So they're all common names in this family, and it's funny how they did that. But if that common name were to end up on a no-fly list, how do they get off of it? And we should have a system or mechanism that would allow that process to occur relatively easy and without any expense to that mistaken person. Ted Kennedy was on a no-fly list, so we should make that policy exist in a way that isn't going to harm a Steve Smith or a Ted Kennedy, but yet a potential shooter like what you saw in the Pulse shooting would not be having easy access to get a gun.
How do people get involved? It looks like, I mean, you need to consider the size of the NRA, and the membership base allows them to have great influence over our elected officials. So what are some groups that people can get involved in and join to show that on the other side of the argument, there is a ton of energy?
Sure. So Moms Demand in Everytown are their organization. They're national organizations that are fighting gun violence. And we have more than 3.5 million members across the country. We have chapters that are active in every single state. And it's very easy to join. And it doesn't require a purchase of a membership of any sort to do so. And folks can be as engaged to whatever degree that they feel comfortable. We do a lot of work with gun violence survivors. That's more of what I do. For my role within the organization, I deal with and I meet fellow gun violence survivors. I help them own their story like I have, and telling their story, whether they want to testify like I have, or write op-eds, or speak publicly about what's happened to them and their experience with gun violence. And we've got about 1,500 survivors in the Survivor Network, and trying to provide an outlet for folks so that they can feel like, they're not alone in this. I mean, there are 93 Americans that are shot and killed every single day. So there are people who are joining the loneliest club ever, more and more often every day. And we want to make sure that if someone is at that point in their life after having that tragedy, that they have a place where they are safe, that they can have a place to exchange ideas and talk about what happened to them, and learn how to take it to the public space if they choose to. But so you can go to everytown.org or momsdemandaction.org and find ways to join. You can also text honor, the word honor, to 64433 to join both organizations. And it's a really good opportunity for folks who are, whether you're Republican or Democrat, independent, gun owner or not, survivor or an ally. We are as bipartisan in this effort as possible, because gun violence does not care about whether you're Republican or Democrat. It does not care about whether you're white or black or what your zip code is. This is something that affects every one of us in our country, because it is a public health crisis, and we need to find ways that we can come together and solve this problem.
Awesome. Well, Khary Penebaker, thank you so much. I think this was really great.
Yeah.
I think I learned a little bit too today, so I really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, man, I really appreciate you having me on.
Absolutely. You can follow Khary at Khary, KHARYP.
If you like what you've heard today and want to support the podcast, follow us on Twitter at ThinkTwicePod and like us on Facebook at ThinkTwice.
And check out our website, thinktwicepodcast.com. And we could absolutely use your support. Please visit patreon.com/thinktwice to view subscription options. For as little as $5 a month, you can support our work. $5. That's 1 cup of coffee a month. Thank you.